All right. Well, good morning, and everyone, and thank you, Jackie. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I hope you've all been able to get out and enjoy some of the Bruce Trail in these last few glorious days. It's my great pleasure today to introduce this last webinar, and it's What's That Plant? Botany on the Niagara Escarpment. And I have the great pleasure of introducing our guests today, both of whom I'm really lucky to work with. So first we have Adam Brylowski. He's been with the Bruce Trail for 10 years, and he helps to manage the land stewardship program. He has a background in urban forestry and ecological restoration, a Bachelor of Environmental Studies from York University, and a post-grad certificate in ecosystem restoration from Niagara College. Prior to working for the BTC, Adam worked at the Forestry Department at the City of Toronto as a natural resource management technician, as well as an organization called Urban Forest Associates that work to restore degraded natural spaces in Toronto. So welcome, Adam. And I also have Brian Popelier with us. And Brian works for the Bruce Trail Conservancy as the Land Stewardship Coordinator, where he utilizes and builds on his years of experience to perform ecological inventories on over 13,000 acres of BTC managed land and prepare management plans for BTC properties, as well as support the BTC clubs in encroachment and ecological issues. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science and Biology from Trent University, as well as certificates in ecological land classification, birds, plant identification, butternut assessment, Ontario pesticide forestry license, and Ontario wetland evaluations. Brian can often be found in the forests and watersheds of Ontario, hiking, fishing, camping, and enjoying the beauty of nature. And Brian's also a talented photographer, and many of his pictures appear in the BTC guidebook. So welcome to you, Brian, and Brian and Adam, over to you.
Thanks very much, Michael. So I'm going to start the presentation. My name's Adam Brylowski, as Michael just said. I'm one of the ecologists, along with Brian, here at the Bruce Trail Conservancy. And today we're going to be taking you along a virtual trip of the plants that you can find along the Bruce Trail and the Niagara Escarpment. So this presentation isn't going to be very heavy on details about identification. It's more of an idea of what you're going to possibly find as you're hiking along the Bruce Trail. So what I really encourage is for you to go out and get a plant identification book or an app and try and test your skills out in the field. See if you can figure out what the species that we just described are, because the best way to learn is to sit with a book and try and parse out exactly what you're looking at, what plants you're looking at. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the presentation. This is our mission, the Bruce Trail Conservancy's mission, preserving a ribbon of wilderness for everyone forever. So the Niagara Escarpment, it's in southern Ontario here. We have over 1,500 species of vascular plants along the Niagara Escarpment. So that's 40% of Ontario's rare flora can be found just down here in southern Ontario along the Niagara Escarpment. We also have the oldest trees in Canada east of the Rocky Mountains. And those are the eastern white cedars that you might see clinging to the face of a cliff, especially if you're getting up to the northern parts of the Bruce Trail. And some of these plants, or those eastern white cedars, have been aged to be well over 1,500 years old. So east of the Rocky Mountains, these are old growth trees. There's 44 of 65 species of orchids in Ontario along the Niagara Escarpment, and there's 50 fern species. So before we get into those species, we'll just generally talk about the two major life zones that the Bruce Trail crosses through. So the most southern life zone in Canada is the deciduous or Carolinian forest zone. So this is about 25% of the population of Canada down in this particular life zone, and it's just 0.25% of the area of Canada. So you've got a great concentration of people, a population density, in a small area, which is really diverse. A huge amount of biodiversity here. So that just goes to talk about the importance of the mission of conservation, particularly in southern Ontario. As you're moving up from the deciduous forest, which has species that are more common in the eastern United States, southeastern United States, you start getting into the mixed forest, which is a bit of a transitional zone between the deciduous and the boreal forest to the north, where there's more coniferous trees, a lot less deciduous. So the line that generally we talk about that separates the deciduous from the mixed forest goes from Grand Bend to Toronto, but it's not necessarily a hard line. There's species that sort of go up and down between these two life zones. So if we're starting down in the deciduous forest, let's see what kind of trees we could find. So black cherry is the tree on the far left there. It's probably one of the most distinct trees that you're going to find along the Bruce Trail. It has bark that looks like cornflakes that's been burnt. It's really, really easy to find. Just looks like tiny little chips. This one here is a bit younger, so the platelets haven't completely broken up. But as it gets older, it just almost looks like it's been singed and someone had put cornflakes, burnt cornflakes on it. Butternut trees are also very common along the Bruce Trail. They love the limestone of the Niagara Escarpment, or the dolostone, sorry, of the Niagara Escarpment. But unfortunately, they're endangered. So they're reacting to a particular fungus that came in, was introduced, and is now completely decimating their populations. They're relatives of the black walnut, so they look very similar to a black walnut. But as you can tell by this picture here, their bark is very light gray, and it almost looks like someone's taken sandpaper and smoothed off the outer ridges, which becomes more apparent if you look up the tree, up the trunk. Basswood is also another really common tree. That's the tree that, if you see a tree with massive leaves, they call it the elephant ear tree, because its trees are sort of almost tropical looking in our forests here. It's a really good carving wood, and it's fantastic for habitat, particularly for yellow-bellied sapsuckers who go and tap on the outer bark to drink the sap early in the spring before there's any kind of other stuff for them to eat. White ash is also really, really common. You can tell white ash generally from the bark. It has very tight diamond-shaped patterned bark, and it also is oppositely arranged. So if you look at a twig, the branches come out at the same spots as opposed to being alternate. And the only two trees on this slide that have that characteristic are white ash and sugar maple. And unfortunately, you've probably heard that our ash populations are being decimated by a beetle called the emerald ash borer, or it's a borer. And right now we're in a really bad stage with that, where almost all mature ash in southern Ontario have been affected by this particular bug. So there's lots being done by the government to try and figure out exactly how to stop this and what can be done to bring back ash in the future. And white birch, again, that's another really popular tree you'll find down in this deciduous area here. It's a sun-loving tree, really hard to mistake with anything else because it's got that characteristic paper sort of bark that birches have. The only other similar species you might see is the yellow birch, which is much darker, and it doesn't really have the same sort of papery bark that you see on the white birch. And sugar maple is definitely our most abundant tree here in southern Ontario. It's the general forest canopy. It is a tree that can survive for a long, long time under the shade. And because of that, it becomes a dominant forest cover. So you'll get a canopy of sugar maples producing dense shade with sugar maples underneath that can tolerate shade. So in those situations, we've got what we call a climax forest, where it's only these species like sugar maple and American beech that can tolerate shade will become the dominant forest cover. So moving on from trees, we'll get into some plants you might see. And a number of these plants here, mayaples, spring beauties, wild ginger, blue cohosh, and yellow trout lily are what we call spring ephemerals. And spring ephemerals are plants that take advantage of the sunlight that occurs in spring before the trees leave out. So when there's no tree leaves in the canopy, the sun can penetrate to the forest floor much easier. And these plants take advantage of that, and they pop up early and they flower. And then by the time the trees have fully leafed out, they're pretty much done with their life cycle. Spring beauties are beautiful little plants. There's two different varieties that Brian's going to get into later on in this conversation. Mayaples, you may have seen, they look like little umbrella plants, and they do have small fruits that it's tough to find because squirrels love them when they're ripe. but they're somewhat edible. The seeds are toxic, but the flesh itself is not. I've tried them, they're great, but I can't recommend eating them because the seeds do have a toxic effect. Wild strawberry is an incredibly common plant you'll find along the Bruce Trail. And there's two different types of wild strawberries. There's a woodland variety, and then there's just the regular common wild strawberry. The woodland variety exists in rich woods, and you can tell the difference because it has a flower that flowers above the leaves, whereas the common wild strawberry, it flowers at the same level as the leaves or below it. So if you're looking for the flower, you'd have to look underneath the leaves. But if you're ever walking through a meadow, look down below the grass, there's a good chance that wild strawberry will be growing as a sort of ground cover. And it does indeed produce strawberries that aren't quite as succulent as the ones that we get from the store, but they're still really tasty. Wild ginger, another great forest cover plant that we have. As you can see from this picture, it's got these sort of burgundy colored flowers that fall onto the ground. And instead of being pollinated by bees or butterflies, they're actually pollinated mostly by beetles that go into the flower and then spread the pollen around. We've also got blue cohosh here, which in this picture, it's just coming up out of the ground. And we always say it looks kind of like a zombie hand coming out first thing in the spring. Eventually, this plant becomes fairly tall, up to 1/2 meter tall. And after it flowers, it produces these blue, almost, they look like berries, but they're not. They're very, very hard. So if you've ever been looking through a forest ground cover and you see a whole host of plants that have gone to seed and they're just a bunch of blueberries, that's blue cohosh. Yellow trout lily is also another really, really important plant for our ground cover in forests. It essentially carpets the entire forest understory or forest ground layer in the springtime, and now it's died off. But these plants are they're very tenacious, and they also the seeds have a slight coating on them that has sugar, like a sugar coating. And ants take those seeds back to their ant hills, eat off all the sugar, throw the seeds away, and then the seeds have this nice fertile ground in the ant refuse to grow up. So it's a symbiotic relationship that happens in the forest. As we're moving on here, these species here are a little bit more Carolinian in nature. So they're species that you don't find that much farther north than the Carolinian life zone. And when we're talking about trees, sassafras, tulip tree, and shagbark hickory are very typical Carolinian trees. We have these on all of our properties down, some of our property, we have all of these on some of our properties down in the Niagara area. Sassafras is a fantastic tree because it's aromatic. The leaves, if you slightly gently rub the leaves, you get this Fruit Loops smell to it, which is kind of fascinating to me. But it's also just a really important component of the forest. Shagbark hickories, as you can see from the picture, they're very distinct. They have bark that is very shaggy, just like their name. And it's hard to really tell them, well, it's easy to tell them apart from everything else because there's really no other hickory that looks like that. Spicebush is another plant that you'll find commonly along the Niagara Escarpment. It really likes calcium-rich soil. So because the Niagara Escarpment sits upon dolostone, which is or it's composed of dolostone, a lot of the soil is very rich in calcium. So some of these plants are just adapted to that, and spicebush is one of them. It's the host to the spicebush swallowtail butterfly. So that species of butterfly relies entirely on that plant. And spicebush, along with sassafras, is really aromatic. So if you go and smush the leaves or just give the leaves a little bit of a brush with your fingers and smell it, it has a citrusy aromatic smell that's just wonderful. I'm going to keep moving on here a bit. So as you're moving a little bit more north, we're getting into the mixed forest zone. So this is where deciduous trees start becoming a little bit more sparse, and the ground cover changes. So you get shrubs like bearberry, and bearberry is a low ground cover, produces red berries that bears eat. The Latin name for bearberry actually means bear grape. So they've named it because they know that bears absolutely love this stuff. Bunchberry is another really common forest ground cover plant as you start getting farther up north, especially up on the Bruce Peninsula. It's a type of dogwood, and as you can see, it's got four to six leaves and one four-petaled white flower right in the middle. Beautiful plant. Twin flower, again, another great ground cover. So this species is actually, it has evergreen leaves that persist throughout the winter, so they never die. And eventually it shoots up these really delicate, nice little pink-white flowers that have one stalk with two flowers coming out. Again, you're going to be seeing this low on the ground. It's a fairly small plant, so less than 20 centimeters. You'd be looking for it on the ground. Fringed polygala is another plant that's very common, especially up north on the Bruce Peninsula. It's also called gay wings. It looks like the leaves are almost leathery, and it has these beautiful irregular purple lavender flowers. Again, a really, really common forest ground cover. Wood betony is something that we see quite often as well along the Bruce Trail. The leaves look a little bit like yarrow, if anyone's familiar with yarrow. They're very sort of frilly, and there's a thick, very hairy stalk that comes up from these basal rosette of leaves. And when I say a basal rosette, I mean the leaves don't come up the stalk. They're only on the ground like a dandelion. And at the top of this thick stalk, there's a flower head that has multiple yellow flowers that are great pollinators. Starflower is very similar to bunchberry, but you can kind of see the difference in leaves. The leaves are much more tapered, very pointy, and the flower itself has much more petals than bunchberry does. This species really likes sort of acidic type soils, so more of a needle, like conifer type trees. It exists in the ground underneath conifer trees. And then there's blue bead lily, which is also a fantastic plant you'll see up north. The leaves almost look like a succulent plant, like aloe vera or something. They're oval shaped, 2 to 4 succulent oval shaped leaves with one stalk that shoots up a flower head that has numerous flowers, and eventually those turn into blue berries as well, which are not edible. They're poisonous, but they look similar to a blueberry. And we couldn't talk about the plants on the Niagara Escarpment without talking about trilliums, because this is something that we see pretty much everywhere. But you may not know that there's a number of different types of trilliums. So the white and the red trillium are the ones that are the most common that we see in the forest floor. But we also have painted and nodding trillium. White trillium, one thing that I should mention is that when it starts to die, it turns pink. And people often confuse that for a different variety or even a painted trillium, but that's just the natural life cycle of a trillium. They slowly turn pink and die after time. Painted trilliums are beautiful. They have sort of a little bit of pinkish red right in the center of the flower. And we can find these more in rich woods with acidic soil. So you've got, pine trees, hemlock trees, slightly wet. We've found this species on our Fairmount wetland property up in the Beaver Valley section. I highly recommend going to search for it up there, but stay on the trail. Nodding trillium is something that I personally haven't seen, but that's partially because of its growth habit, where the flower does nod forward underneath the leaves. So in a field of trilliums or in a forest of trilliums, it may be difficult to point it out because the flower is obscured by the leaves. So as we are getting north, coniferous trees become more abundant. And the ones that would probably see the most would be these that are on the screen. Eastern hemlock, which is my favorite tree, is really abundant, but it's very finicky. So you mostly get it on north-facing slopes that are really rich, have rich soil, and it's a conifer. So these are all conifers, meaning that they produce cones instead of flowers and fruits. So the seeds from these trees are produced inside the cones. Eastern hemlock is also a fantastic tree because it's a climax species. I mentioned that with sugar maple and American beech. So it can survive in the shade for up to hundreds of years, up to 200 years as a small sapling, waiting for a break in the canopy where it can maximize its productivity and shoot up into the sky. White pines, everyone's probably familiar with white pines, but these are the trees that generally, the old mature white pine trees will sit above the forest canopy. They're what we call super canopy trees. They're just shooting straight up to try and maximize their light collection. And one way to tell a white pine from a red pine is by the number of needles in a bunch. So if you pick out a bunch of needles, a white pine will have 5 and a red pine will have 2 or 3. So very different. White pines look a lot more bushy than red pines. Balsam firs are also really common up on the Bruce Peninsula. And oftentimes walking through a balsam fir forest, you can just smell them. There's a sweet smell of balsam firs. And you can see on the bark here, there's sort of little notches or knobs on them. And if you press into these knobs, they exude sap. So your fingers will get sticky, but that's a very common characteristic of balsam fir, is that it's got these sort of nobules that contain sap. I've mentioned eastern white cedar before. That's the species that can grow on the face of the Niagara Escarpment and live up to 1,500 years old. This is a super common species along the Bruce Trail. If you've ever gone through cedar swamps, you'll know how densely it can grow. There's certain areas where only cedar will grow and literally have no ground cover because it creates such a thick, dense canopy that it just prevents other species from growing. But it's incredibly tolerant of wetness and is important for swamp communities. And white spruce is just another great component of our forests here. It looks similar to a balsam fir, but with a white spruce, what you're looking for in terms of identification is the needles being all the way around, almost like a brush, sort of like a brush you use to clean your dishes with, that kind of thing. Balsam firs, the needles are flat, as they are with eastern hemlocks. White spruces, the needles go in a sort of circular pattern all the way down the stem. So another community that we have not abundantly on our properties, actually we're trying to encourage this type of community on our properties, is tallgrass prairie. And once in Ontario, it used to cover 1,000 kilometers squared, and now only about 30 square kilometers remains in very fragmented sites. So this is an important community because there's certain plants that just require open, dry habitats in order to thrive. And we just installed did the first installation of a project on our Fisher's Pond Nature Reserve property, where Brian and I seeded about 4 hectares worth of old agricultural land into tallgrass prairie. So it's a project that's going to take quite some time to fully come to term, but eventually we're hoping that a number of these species will be there. Big blue stem is the one species that we put in abundance. And big blue stem is a grass. It's a prairie grass, very tall. The tips of the seed, the grass seeds, almost look like a turkey's foot, and it'll grow much taller than you or I while you're standing beside it. So it's fairly easy to see in that sense. Another common prairie species is black or brown-eyed Susan. And this is, you'll see is in garden centers and whatnot, but it's a native plant and it thrives in sort of open, dry conditions. Wild bergamot, another interesting plant. Its leaves almost have an oregano smell to it, and it loves open, dry conditions. As you can see from the picture on the bottom right here, it has a cluster of purple tubular flowers. And those flowers are great for pollinators. They actually include a tiny little lip for small insects to sit on and get into their nectar. Moving to the left, we've got tall sunflower. Everyone's familiar with sunflowers, the big ornamental ones that we have, but we do have a variety of sunflowers that are native to Ontario, and tall sunflower is one of them. Canada tick trefoil is a species that I became very familiar with when I was working in High Park in Toronto, because it's a prairie species and a savanna species. And in High Park, there is a black oak savanna that was being restored. So we would plant all kinds of tick trefoil. And the one thing I remember the most about it is that in the fall, it's one of those plants that creates seeds with sticky burrs. So if you're walking through a meadow with Canada tick trefoil in it, at the end of the day, you're going to be covered with these half moon shaped burrs that they're all over you. I'm going to move on a little bit here to keep this rolling. Another thing that you're going to see in meadows is plants that aren't necessarily native, but they become naturalized. The only native plant in this slide here is common milkweed, which we probably all know is really, really important because it's the host plant of the monarch butterfly. And it's incredibly important to provide habitat for monarchs. On one of our properties in Toronto, we've done milkweed plantings, and we've actually had some of our volunteers rear and release over 100 monarchs in support of keeping their population alive. Fleabanes are actually native as well, and they're a species that you'll find, they almost look like an aster. You'll find those in meadows as well. They got their name because traditionally it was believed that burning the plant would keep fleas away, hence the name fleabane. Red clover, bird's foot trefoil, and meadow buttercup or tall buttercup are all introduced from Europe, but they become an important part of the ecosystem here. Red clover and bird's foot trefoil in particular are incredibly important for foraging for livestock. So they're introduced as fodder for cattle or other sorts of livestock that graze, and have become naturalized. So there's a difference between an invasive species and a naturalized non-native species. Red clover and bird's foot trefoil, you can find them everywhere, but they don't tend to take over ecosystems at the expense of other species. And goldenrods. So one thing to mention as well is that apart from going from south to north on the Bruce Trail and getting a variety of different plants, seasons also matter. So in the fall, we'll get goldenrods popping up. In the spring, you've got spring ephemerals. In the summer, you've got most wildflowers. In the fall, you get goldenrods and asters. And the first sure tell that you're getting into fall is when the goldenrods start blooming. And you'll look at a field and it's turned yellow. The most common goldenrod is Canada goldenrod in the bottom left. And that is just a tall, straight plant that's very abundant. You might have noticed that some goldenrods get a gall. There's a small circular gall on it, and that's particular to Canada goldenrod. And inside that gall is actually the larva of a wasp that was deposited there, and material has formed around it. Eventually it eats its way out, pupates, and turns into a wasp, and the cycle starts anew. Grass-leaved goldenrod is one of my favorite goldenrods because it's just so different. It's different in the sense that its leaves are much more fine, and when it blooms, it has a flower head that's flat. And it's hard to mistake that for the other goldenrods. As you can see, they have more of like a wand-like flower structure. The rough-stemmed goldenrod is similar to that wand-like flower structure. And the difference between rough-stemmed goldenrod is that it's, oh boy, apologies, is the leaves itself are deeply, deeply veined. So they have almost a coarse texture to it. And you'll find this goldenrod more in wet areas. It really likes having its feet wet a little bit. The opposite of that is gray goldenrod that loves sort of dry conditions. It's called gray goldenrod because it has thick hairs, gray hairs, like a layer of hairs up along the stem. That's very obvious once you get closer to it, but from farther back, it almost looks like it's covered in dew. And this particular goldenrod has a flower head that only flowers on one side. So it's the top, there's no flowers on the bottom of the stem, only on the top. And then if we get into the forest, there are certain goldenrods that thrive there as well. Blue-stemmed goldenrod and zigzag goldenrod are the two that are the most abundant. Zigzag goldenrod is, as you can tell, the leaves here, the picture that's second from the right, are much bigger. They're toothed as well. So they have edges all along the leaves. And this is a really, really common species. And they call it zigzag goldenrod because the stems do have a zigzag pattern. Blue stem goldenrod is also quite unique because the flowers form at the leaf axils. So instead of having one terminal branch or stem with a flower cluster at the top, the flowers are all the way down the leaf axils throughout the plant. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to get into some asters, which I mentioned were also fall blooming plants. So take it away, Brian.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some asters. Asters and goldenrods, they even drive us ecologists crazy when it comes to identification. We've, in this webinar, we've kind of picked some more of the easier ones to identify when you're on a hike. So one of the easiest asters, I think, is the New England aster. It's got beautiful big flower heads with the purple petals. And if you look to the picture of the leaves, the leaf kind of clasps the stem, and the stem's got a little bit of hair on it. So I find this aster is one of the easiest to identify, and it's also one of the most common asters. So we'll move on to the next one. So this one is frost or oldfield aster. Once again, a beautiful aster in a meadow that you'll find. It has white petals instead of the violet or purple petals. And one of its most distinguishing features is, if you look in the middle photo, you can see how hairy that stem is. When you see this aster in the field, you can really tell like how much hair it has on the stem. There are other asters that do have like a hairy stem, but this one just has a much hairier stem than any other aster. And the leaves are very linear. So it's pretty easy to identify once you're walking through the field. Panicled aster. So this one can be confused with the previous frost aster. Once again, it has smaller white flower heads. It also has a bit of a hairy stem, but it just doesn't have the hairs aren't the length of the previous frost aster. And a lot of times it has a bit of a purplish stem. Oh, I just lost the, might have to talk in the dark here. Anyway, oh, there we go. I'm at the head office, and our office, we have motion detectors on the lights. So if you don't move around a lot, the lights go off. So that's just what happened there. So anyway, back to panicled aster. It also has very linear leaves, linear and long leaves. But this is an aster that's very, very common in meadows and in fields, roadsides, possibly along your fence line in your yard. So very common aster and very important aster. Like all asters, these are very important pollinators that come up in the fall. So our bees, our bumblebees, our butterflies, this is their food source prior to some of them going back down south for the winter or hibernating underground over the winter. So asters and goldenrods are hugely important for our native pollinators. So like goldenrods, there's asters that grow in meadows and there's asters that grow in forests. So when you're looking at plant ID, it is important to know where you are. So as you're hiking the trail and you see an aster in a forest, you have to ask yourself, would that be a panicled aster? It's doubtful, because I'm in a forest, I'm not in a meadow, so it has to be something else. So this is probably one of the most common woodland asters. It's called calico aster. Once again, little white flower heads. You'll notice that asters either have a white color or a purplish color. So that's another way to learn your idea of asters, is know what color goes with which plant. So calico asters, they have a little bit wider linear leaf than panicled aster or frost aster. And as you can see, pretty bushy little plant. So if you see a white-headed aster in the forest, it's probably going to be a calico aster. Large-leaved aster. This is probably one of the easiest asters to identify, just basically because of the giant leaf that has at the basal leaves, and it has a little bit bigger purple flower on it. But you can't mistake these leaves for any other aster. So once again, it's really easy aster to identify. Common bluewood aster. So if you were to mistake the large leaf aster with something, it would be this aster. But its leaves are a lot smaller than the large leaf aster. And its flower heads are purple, but they're also a little bit smaller. And it's also called heartleaf aster because the leaves tend to look like a heart. So the Bruce beckons. So we have this slide because the Bruce Peninsula, it's a special place. There's a lot of plants found up there that you really don't find anywhere else. A lot of that has to do with the geology, the weather patterns up there, and there's certain habitats called alvars, which are globally rare habitats that there tend to be a lot of on the Bruce Peninsula. And so some of these plants you kind of only find in alvar situations. So that's why you kind of don't see these anywhere else. So we'll just go through them real quick. The dwarf lake iris is a very, very tiny blue-violet flowered iris. It's mostly found on the Lake Huron side of the Bruce Peninsula, but we have found some small populations on the Georgian Bay side. Wood lily, very, very common lily. We often find on forest edges, sometimes in interior forests, sometimes in meadows. It seems to really grow just wherever conditions are favorable. You can't mistake this lily. It just has an upright standing flower. A lot of our other native orange lilies, their flowers droop, but this flower just stands upright and you can't miss it. And it has very thin linear leaves that are whorled, so that means the leaves come out from one spot on the stem. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous wildflower, and if you ever see it, it's worth taking pictures of. The cylindric blazing star. So there's several blazing stars in Ontario, but this one we find the most common up in the alvars of the Bruce Peninsula. Once this is in flower, like late May, sometimes in the early June, they'll cover an entire alvar system. It's just beautiful to look at. Once again, very, very important pollinator species, especially when our insects are just kind of coming back or coming in during the spring. They really need these some of these early wildflowers. Hill's thistle. A lot of people don't like thistles because, they're a little bit painful. But this is a special one. It's a species at risk, and it's pretty much endemic to the Bruce Peninsula and Manitoulin Island, which means it's only found in Ontario in those certain areas. Very distinctive because it's a bit low growing and it only has the one flower head. A lot of our thistles produce more than one flower head, but the Hills thistle, as you can see in the picture, very low growing, and it just has that beautiful purplish, pinkish flower head, just once again standing upright. Painted brush. This is probably one of the easiest wildflowers to identify when it's in flower. You can see it's got that bright orange color. Sometimes they come up a mix of orange and yellow. Sometimes they come up just yellow, but that flower structure, very, very distinctive. It's a very distinctive wildflower up on the Bruce. We have very few native flowers that are orange in color. So right here, we have two of them. And death camas. So this is, they call it death camas because it is poisonous. It's a poisonous plant. But once again, if you look at that flower structure, it's very, very distinctive plant. Almost like a star, white stars that are kind of erupting from the base of the plant. Probably one of my favorite wildflowers to see in the wild. And its leaves are very linear and long, and they kind of come out of the ground and almost arch. So you have these arching bunch of linear leaves with this beautiful flower sitting atop them. So the Bruce Peninsula is a very special place. So I highly recommend, if you want to look at wildflowers, head up that way. Ferns. So we often get a lot of questions. Ferns are like asters and goldenrods, sometimes can be a tough group. This first page, I've kind of picked some of the more easier ones to identify. So we have the hart's tongue fern. It's a species at risk, very, very common along the Niagara Escarpment. The most populations of hart's tongue fern in Canada are actually along the Niagara Escarpment. It just loves that dolostone, shallow soil, sugar maple forests. Just by looking at that picture, it's a very distinct looking fern. I don't think anybody that has seen hart's tongue fern can mistake it for anything else. So another fern I find similar to hart's tongue that is very distinctive, and once you see it and learn it, you'll never forget what it looks like, and that's the walking fern. Very, like, the leaves taper to a point, and once again, it's very distinctive, very low growing, loves to grow on moss covered big boulders. It's not a very common fern, but it's not rare. It's kind of one of those ferns that's right in the middle, but hasn't been considered a species at risk yet. And that's why the work we do is so important, because we protect habitat for these species that need homes and need to be protected. So they call it walking fern because if you notice in the picture, when that leaf tapers or that frond tapers to that really thin tip, those sometimes lean over and actually touch the ground. And then from that point, the walking fern will actually start another frond. So it almost looks like it's walking if you get a bunch of them. Ebony spleenwort. Once again, very, very distinctive. Not a very common fern. We've only seen it once on a Bruce Trail property, and that's up in the Owen Sound area. Funny thing is, I've only seen it once on the Bruce Trail, and I always thought it was kind of more of a northern mixed forest fern. But recently, in the past year, doing some exploring on my off time, I keep finding clumps of this fern down in the Carolinian zone. I found two areas where it's growing like grass. There's so much of it. So obviously, it's not just a mixed forest species. And you got the maidenhair fern, which is a very, very delicate, special looking fern of really rich, high quality forests. It's very distinctive looking as well. Like I said, all these ferns on this page I think are a little bit easier to identify. The maidenhair spleenwort is right above the maidenhair fern. So you can kind of see they do look a little bit similar, but the maidenhair fern is a much bigger, taller plant, whereas maidenhair spleenwort just covers boulders, limestone or dolostone soil along the entire Niagara Escarpment, from Tobermory all the way down to Niagara Falls. You can find maidenhair spleenwort, although it's a lot more common in the northern areas. Northern broadbeach fern is another not very common fern, but we've seen it a few times. And just the pattern of the fronds, the way it fans out like that, seems to be like an identifying feature. There is a rare species of broadbeach fern, and the difference is that the bottom two fronds, the northern broadbeach fern, isn't connected. So there isn't, there's like a little marginal leaf that connects the bottom two fronds in the rare fern, but that doesn't exist in the more common northern broadbeach fern. So a lot of times when it comes to botany and looking at stuff, like trying to identify plants, sometimes there's so minute details between species that you really got to learn your stuff to be able to identify some of these ferns properly. And a perfect example is on this next page. So these are three woodland ferns. They call them wood ferns. So if you look in the middle picture, the intermediate wood fern, and then the spinulose wood fern, those look very, very common. Their frond structure is very similar. Their growth structure is very similar. They both have a very feathery appearance. But if you notice the thumb in the middle picture, you see the bottom row of fronds, the innermost frond is shorter than the one beside it. So that identifies this fern as intermediate wood fern. In the spinulous wood fern, those innermost frond, they're actually longer than the one beside them. So if you look closely at those two pictures, you can see the difference. And there you go, Adam's kind of showing you right there. So see how those are longer than the one beside it, and then the other one, they're shorter. So that's how you decipher those two species of fern. So you really got to look closely sometimes at plants to get the identifying features. Marginal wood fern, I find, is it's a wood fern, but it's pretty easy to identify. When the spores are out on this particular fern, so you basically turn the fern, you look at the underside of the fronds, the spores line along the margins of the I guess you call it the rachis. So the little spores are right around on the margins of the leaves, and that's how you identify it as marginal wood fern. And it's not as feathery looking as the other two. Orchids, yeah, we can't talk about plants along the Niagara Escarpment and the Bruce Trail without talking about orchids. People love orchids, and for good reason. These are just beautiful, beautiful plants. If you're a birder, people are always looking for warblers because they're one of the most colorful groups of birds, and active and just beautiful birds. So orchids are basically considered the warblers of the flower world. Everybody wants to see an orchid. Very important when you're talking about orchids and all of the plants we're showing you, and any plant on the Niagara Escarpment or the Bruce Trail, just leave them alone. Take a nice picture. If possible, especially with orchids, you don't want to get right up, standing right beside it, kneeling down with your knee right beside, because sometimes even that little bit of soil compaction can affect the growth of the plant. And it has been shown sometimes that certain orchid species, when the soil is disturbed around it, that they don't survive as well. So once again, there's so many orchids along the Bruce Trail. And we've kind of stuck to some of the more common ones that when you're on that trail and you don't leave that trail, it's possible that you may see some of these. So the Queen's Lady Slipper, very distinctive. You cannot mistake this orchid. The flower is just gigantic. It's a tall orchid, sometimes easily over 1 foot tall. Sometimes I've even seen them up to 2 feet. So just a beautiful, easily identifiable orchid. You find these a lot of times more in wetter areas. A lot of wetlands, you'll find the lady slippers, the Queen's Lady Slipper. The yellow lady slipper, once again, I don't think anybody can misidentify this flower. It's very, very common along the Niagara Escarpment, especially when you get up Gray and Bruce area. They just line the roadsides. They're almost like dandelions up there. There's a subspecies. So there's the large yellow lady slipper, which is what this one is. And then there's a small yellow lady slipper. Obviously it's a lot smaller and more delicate. I find the small yellow lady slipper, if you do take a sniff of the flower, it has a vanilla scent to it, which is one of the characteristic distinguishing factors of the smaller subspecies. Menzies rattlesnake plantain. Once again, very, very common a lot of times in our coniferous forests, more up north than down south. I have a picture of the leaves because a lot of times with these plants, you see the leaves more than you actually see the flower. And the leaves are very distinctive with that green color, with that white line down the middle. When you see that leaf pattern, you can't mistake the Menzies rattlesnake plantain. The showy orchis, so very small, low-growing orchid. With the petals are distinctive with that very light purple color, and then down below, more, I guess, the lip is a white color. We got these on 3 Bruce Trail properties up in the Owen Sound area. Very easy to miss because they are so low growing and they don't flower for that long. So, as you're walking along, it's very easy to pass these by. As with most orchids, when they're not in flower, they're a lot less noticeable. So when they're in flower, it is the time to catch them and to learn your ID. The northern green orchid, very common, once again, up in the northern areas. It's very green. They call it the green orchid for a reason. Not a very showy orchid, but it has just a whole bunch of flower heads on the stem when it does go into flower. A lot of these northern green orchid can be found in wetlands. It can be found I've found it in just mature forest, just growing. Along the Bruce Trail, it really likes seeps. So that's where the water is kind of running off the escarpment. So even in the summer, you can see water, when you're stepping over those small areas of running water, that's where you kind of stop and look around and see if you can spot a northern green orchid. So I had to include helleborine. Oh, that's that little picture there beside the Queen's Lady Slipper. It's a very common orchid, but it's a non-native orchid. It's European in source, but it's probably one of the most common orchids you will see as you're walking the Bruce Trail, unfortunately. But even though it's non-native, it's not invasive. In your yard, sometimes it can become invasive. But the flower, your typical orchid flower. So, like I said, even though it's not native, it's still a beautiful looking flower. So now we're going to look at some more. These are the coral roots. So these are also in the orchid family. So the 3 most common ones that you'll possibly see along the trail is early coral root, spotted coral root, and striped coral root. Striped coral root is the one that I see the most often. I've seen it in deciduous forests, and I've seen it in coniferous forests, and I've seen it in mixed forests. Very distinctive. It has the flowers have stripes on them, hence the common name, striped coral root. Spotted coral root, as you can see, has spots on it. Sometimes the people who name these flowers, I think they know what they're doing, right? To make it easy to identify. Spotted coral root is a lot less common. I've only seen it once up on our one of our properties in the Bruce Peninsula. And then early coral root is more of a wet species. It likes those coniferous swamps, mixed swamps. Like Adam says, it likes to get its feet wet. So a lot less, or a lot more difficult to find because a lot of the Bruce Trail tends to stay in the drier areas. But yeah, if you get a chance and there's a boardwalk through a swamp or a marsh, you might be lucky enough to find early coral root. It's a lot more greener in color than the other two coral roots. And it's got a little bit of spotting on the petal, but not a lot. It's mostly unmarked white lipped. And then you have Alaska orchid on the bottom. So it's not a coral root, but it's also very common along the Bruce Trail. Very indistinct plant. It's not once again, it's not showy. It's green in color. Doesn't get that tall. The close-up of the flowers, you can see they're not very showy. So once again, a very easy plant to walk right by and not even notice it. So yeah, when you're walking and you're looking for certain species, you really got to pay attention. So now we're going to have a look at some lookalikes. So our first one is American ginseng and wild sarsaparilla. So you can see in the pictures, very easy to misidentify these two species. The big difference between the two is the lower leaves. If you notice the American ginseng, the two or three lower leaves are smaller than the three leaves above it. Whereas in sarsaparilla, the leaves are, the one leaf at least is bigger than the ones above it. And sarsaparilla, the two bottom leaves are usually different sizes, as you can see in the picture. One's a little bit smaller than the other one. The thing is with these two plants is American ginseng is a rare species in Ontario. It's a species at risk, and it's highly poached for its medicinal value. So when we do talk about species at risk, and as you're learning the botanical trade and you're identifying stuff, if you do find the species at risk, especially this plant, we ask that you please do not tell anybody. Even if it's a friend, sometimes information can get out. People like to poach plants. The plants are easy to poach because they don't move, they just sit there. And we've seen populations of American ginseng just get wiped out by once their location is known. Especially when you're using apps like iNaturalist, for instance. It geotags the location when you take a picture and upload it, but there's an option that you can take that geotag off. So it's fine to take a picture of it and upload it, but you have to make sure that the location is hidden. So because poachers actually look at those apps and they look for rare species. That also goes for orchids, any species of orchid. Highly poachable. People think they can dig up an orchid and plant it in their garden, and it just doesn't work because plants grow in an area for a reason, especially native plants. There's certain soil conditions, there's symbiotic relationships with fungi and insects that just cannot be recreated in your garden. So just don't leave the plants alone. Take a picture and enjoy it later. So here's the green dragon and Jack in the pulpit. So they're in the same family, but they're different species. Jack in the pulpit, very, very common. I think most people, when they see one of these, they recognize it. The spathe or the flower of the Jack in the pulpit kind of has a hood over it, an arching hood. Whereas the green dragon, if you look at the bottom of the picture, you can see like a long, there you go. So that's the flower of the green dragon. So the flowers are distinctively different. The leaves sort of have a similar look to them. The thing with the green dragon is it's a Carolinian species, so you won't, up in Graham, Bruce, and Dufferin County, those areas you will not see a green dragon, but Jack in the Pulpit we'll see all the way from Niagara Falls all the way to Togonoma. So Adam talked about spring beauty. So these are one of the first wildflowers that pop in the spring. So we have two species in southern Ontario, Virginia spring beauty and Carolina spring beauty. The difference being the flowers are the same, but it's the leaf you got to look at. So a lot of species, when it comes to identification, you got to look at the flower, you got to look at the stem. Is the stem hairy? Is it smooth? And then you got to look at the leaves. So here's one species where the Virginia spring beauty, the leaves are very linear and skinny, whereas the Carolina spring beauty, you can see the leaves are much more wider and elliptical. And that's the identifying feature between these two. And also Carolina spring beauty is more of a northern species. Virginia spring beauty, you don't really get too much past Owen Sound. So location is important as well. So we can't have a plant talk without talking about invasive species. So we just included 4 of the most common species and probably 4 of the most that have been here the longest. So we'll go into garlic mustard, very, very common, very invasive. It's got kind of scalloped shaped leaves, 4-petaled white flowers, very easy to identify. If you see a 4-petaled flower, that's all there is growing, it's probably garlic mustard. If you, especially in the spring, if you crunch up the leaves, give a little sniff, it actually has the scent of garlic. And it's actually very tasty. It was brought over from Europe as an herb to be used in cooking. I actually, every spring, I pick a whole bunch of it and I make garlic mustard pesto, and it's delicious. It's very easy. Just mix up some olive oil in there, a little bit of salt, and put it in the blender, and it's really good. So I really suggest people go out and pick garlic mustard. The BTC doesn't condone foraging. We don't want people to pick species for food, but we will allow you to pick garlic mustard because it's invasive. So the next species, giant hogweed, once again, very easy plant to identify because it's giant. These things can grow up to 10, 12 feet high. It generally likes some more wetter habitat. So it's found along streams and riverbanks, but we have seen it. We've seen it in Dyer's Bay on one of our properties right beside the road. Just don't know how it gets there, but doing really well. So it's in the carrot family. So it has the white umbel of flowers kind of held above the leaves. The leaves are gigantic, and they're more intricately cut. We have a native species called cow parsnip, which looks very, very similar, but the leaves on giant hogweed tend to be more cut, like the lobes, than our native cow parsnip. And giant hogweed, the stem tends to have a lot more purple streaking on the stem as well. If you find giant hogweed, don't touch it. Contact someone else. If it's on Bruce Trail property, you would contact myself and Adam, because the sap, if you get the sap on your skin, it can actually react with the sun, give you 3rd-degree burns. If you get the sap in your eyes, it can cause blindness. Oh. In the dark again. All right, I'll just finish it in the dark. So yeah, giant hogweed. If you see it, stay away from it. Dog strangling vine, very, very invasive plant. Where this stuff grows, it just takes over and nothing else will grow in its place. So very distinctive though, because it is a vine. And if you look at the pictures, it has kind of little delicate purple flowers. And the leaves are opposite and quite pointed. It's actually, it's in the same family as milkweed. So it's very important that we get rid of this plant because monarch butterflies mistakenly lay their eggs on dog strangling vine, thinking it's milkweed, and then when the caterpillars hatch, they can't feed on it, so they end up starving and dying. So we need to get rid of that dog strangling vine. So our last one is a shrub. So it's called common buckthorn. Probably one of the most common invasive species. It was brought over by European settlers. They planted it along fence rows because it grows fast and bushy, but it becomes very, very invasive. So it usually has very shiny, lightly toothed leaves. And if you notice the leaf veins, they kind of go parallel with the center leaf vein. So that's one of the diagnostic characteristics. It has like a darker grayish bark. If you take a knife or a stone and kind of scrape the bark a little bit, it has like an orangey underlayer to it. And the berries are black or very dark purple. All right.
I can jump in here since you're in the dark there, Brian.
I'll try to get the lights on.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So these are questions that were sent into us. So first one, how does one kill wild chervil? Well, the best practice is to cut it down before the flowers go to seed. If you wait till after, then you've just wasted your time because the seed has already fallen and now next year's patch is ready to go. So if it's a smaller patch, you can use a weed whacker, like a lawnmower, and you can cut it, but you'd have to keep cutting it and never let it go to flower. If it's a very small patch, you can dig it up by the roots. But unfortunately, with wild chervil, which is an invasive species, it's really prevalent up in Gray County, and it just takes over. There's whole ditches, whole forest understories that have been taken over by this plant. So with patches like that, the only option, unfortunately, is to use pesticides to treat it because it's just so work intensive to try to take care of wild chervil. Next question is, I need help identifying poison ivy. So I think everyone's a little bit tentative about poison ivy, but once you get to know it, it's very easy to identify. So if you look at the picture, it's got 3 leaves. The leaves are a little bit low. Sometimes the leaves get shiny, but the main distinguishing factor for poison ivy is, you see that terminal leaflet, it has a longer stalk than the leaflets underneath it. Yeah, Adam's pointing that out with the arrow. So that's the main distinguishing, identifying feature of poison ivy. A lot of other 3-leaf plants, like wild strawberry, for instance, that terminal leaf will not have that long stalk on it. Poison ivy it's tough to identify because it has so many variations. Sometimes the leaves don't have lobes on them. Sometimes the leaves aren't shiny. Sometimes they are shiny. This plant can grow as a shrub, a vine, or a herbaceous plant. So it takes many forms, but that longer leaf stalk is always going to be there. So regardless of other characteristics of the plant. You taking this one, Adam?
Sure. So this next question is, what field guides would you recommend for identification of wildflowers, plants, trees while walking on the trail? Well, the 2 most common field guides for wildflowers in this region are Peterson's and Newcomb's. And they're both slightly different in the way that you key out the plants. Peterson's is divided more into the color of the flower, whereas Newcomb's has a slightly different way of identifying them, but they're both fantastic. Owen Sound Field Naturalists, they have a series of books that are really, really great. They have one on orchids and one on ferns, and both of those are super important because they deal specifically with our region here, which is what you really want in an identification book or app, is something that's for Eastern North America or even Ontario is much better. Because if you're getting an ID book that's European, you're not really going to get all the species that are here. Another thing that you can really do is, there's a ton of apps. And iNaturalist is one app that we have a Bruce Trail project running through. And Brian had mentioned iNaturalist earlier. It's a fantastic app for learning about plants and taking pictures of plants and having other people help you identify what they are. Moving on, the next question. I recognize poison ivy, but can't say I would recognize any other hazardous plants. I'd like to know more. Well, there are a couple things that Brian got into. He mentioned giant hogweed already, which is incredibly hazardous. It's toxic. But one of its relatives is wild parsnip, which is something that we see a little bit more on Gray and Bruce counties along the side of roads. And it's got this sort of, similar to giant hogweed or Queen Anne's lace, other members of the parsley family, it has a stalk with a flat-topped sort of orange cluster of flowers. And it's the same thing with this species. If you rub into it, it could have potentially toxic effects to you. Not everybody's affected by these. Same with poison ivy. Not everybody is susceptible to poison ivy. Luckily, Brian and myself don't get it that bad because we have to walk through waist-deep poison ivy all the time for this job. But everybody's susceptibility level is different. But it's always best to practice caution around anything. And okay, I'll move on to the next one here. What are some of the rare species only or popularly found along the Bruce Trail? Well, the first thing that came to mind was Jefferson salamander. So this is a species of salamander that it's called a mole salamander. It tunnels underneath the ground into rock crevices. So it only comes up to breed in late or early spring when there's still a little bit of snow and ice on the ground. And then once it's done that, it goes underground for the rest of the year. But it's not quite endemic to the Niagara Escarpment, but we find it in Ontario. It's mostly found along the Niagara Escarpment. And we've been part of projects to work with the recovery team that's working on the Jefferson salamander. And we've identified it on a number of our properties in the Speyside area, which is sort of helping our restoration efforts there. Another species that you're going to find along the Bruce Trail is the Massasauga rattlesnake. And it's not necessarily specific to the Niagara Escarpment because there's other populations of rattlesnakes in Ontario. In Wainfleet, there's a population, and then also up near Penetanguishene, there's a population of rattlesnakes. But they're all completely separated from each other. So along the Bruce Trail, we do have rattlesnakes, and those are sort of the northern part of the Bruce Peninsula, and you don't really get them farther than here, or south of that, because they've been extirpated. Peregrine falcons are something else that you might find along the face of the Niagara Escarpment because they love building their nests on escarpment faces. We have them here in Hamilton, actually, but that's only because there's certain buildings that they've become accustomed to nesting on. But we do have them on our properties. Up on our Malcolm Bluff Shores property, we have a nesting pair of peregrine falcons that they're beautiful looking, and we see them all the time. And then the other species I mentioned earlier was the old growth white cedar. Now, white cedar is not rare in Ontario, but it's in this particular form where it's growing almost like a bonsai tree on the side of the Niagara Escarpment. It is the oldest type of tree east of the Rocky Mountains, so that's something to talk about for sure. So I'll just finish this last question here about poison ivy. Lots of questions about poison ivy. It's a hot topic for sure. Why is there so much poison ivy along the Bruce Peninsula? Well, the thing is, it's not just on the Bruce Peninsula, it's everywhere. It's a very adaptable plant. It's really hardy, can tolerate tons of different types of conditions. And as Brian said, it's got a bunch of different growth forms. So it can grow in the southern parts of Ontario. There's a a certain subspecies that grows like a vine, and it'll grow up trees and then send lateral branches like a tree branch. So at eye height, you could have poison ivy waving in your face and you could brush into it. But more commonly, and especially up on the northern parts of the Bruce Peninsula, it's a very common ground cover. So it's just a species that thrives in these conditions, and it's tolerant to disturbance. So when the Bruce Trail goes through a patch of poison ivy, it doesn't mind whatsoever, and it just keeps growing up over the trail, which keeps our trail guys pulling their hair out, so to speak. I'll give this one to you there, Brian.
Okay. Is there a good app that helps identify mushrooms specifically? So there are several apps, but neither of us have ever used them, so I can't really comment. To be honest, I'm more of a field guide person, so I like to have my field guide with me in the field, and if I see mushrooms, I pull it out of my backpack and then I use that. iNaturalist is probably, I have used iNaturalist. There's a lot of experts on iNaturalist, so if you take a picture of a mushroom and put it up there, someone will likely identify it, at least down to genus level. You might not get the species. Probably the best field guide for this region is called The Mushrooms of Northeast North America by George Fern. That's the one that myself and Adam use. Next question. What are the most vulnerable and endangered species of plants on the Bruce Trail? So we've talked about a few of them, but American ginseng is one of the most vulnerable because it's poached and sold on the black market. So it's more of it's a financial risk because people make money from picking American ginseng. So that's what makes it so endangered. The butternut is another one because it has the butternut canker, which there is no cure for. So the butternuts are getting sick, and there's not a lot that we can do. There are programs in place to try to save them, but nothing's really out there in full force yet to help the butternut. And then the American chestnut is another one that, another big tree, used to be very, very common in Ontario, but then a blight came over from across the ocean and basically wiped out the American chestnut from our landscape. There's still a few here and there, but once again, there's no known cure. There are programs trying to find cures and help this tree, but once again, nothing substantially has happened yet. So next question, is dog strangling vine on the Bruce Trail, and what is being done about it? Yes, it is on the Bruce Trail. It's very, very common in the Niagara to Halton region. It's becoming more common in Caledon region, so it's moving up. But what's being done about it? There's a whole bunch of organizations working to help get rid of invasive species. Myself and Adam, we work with our volunteers. We work with partner organizations. We have just eradication programs for specific species. We either pull it out of the ground, our volunteers cut it. We have invasive species parties where we get together. Used to be more than 5 people, but now we've slimmed them down to 5 people or less. But we go out there and we pull it, cut it, and sometimes on really big populations, we apply pesticides. And like I said, we work with other organizations such as Nature Conservancy of Canada and Credit Valley Conservation. We team up with them and just attack these species to try to lessen their impact. Next question, where can I pick up edible plants and mushrooms? In quotes, we ask that you leave nothing but your thanks and take nothing but photographs. We never promote the eating of wild species, just because this stuff, it's nature and we need to leave it alone. Good example is American ginseng. You know, people are picking it and it's becoming a species at risk. Wild leeks is another plant that people are just beginning to overpick. And in Quebec, it's actually become a species at risk because of wild foraging. So we at the Bruce Trail Conservancy, we do not condone basically eating any plant or a mushroom. So.
Well, that's it for the questions there.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Brian and Adam. And I've got a few more questions that popped up during the actual webinar. And so, again, these series with you are always so popular and so many great questions. So thanks for all of you that are asking. The first question is, do black cherry trees produce berries?
Right, that's a good question. Yeah, I'll take that one. They do produce berries. They produce cherries, and they're a lot smaller than the cherries that we're used to eating, and they're also not as palatable, so they're much, much more sour. But one of the things that early settlers did with black cherries to utilize them was throw them in a bunch of, in a jar full of alcohol, and season the alcohol with cherries, and you get this this drink called black cherry bounce. I've never tried it myself, but it sounds delicious. But they do produce cherries, an excellent source of food for native wildlife.
Okay, great. I was wondering that myself, actually. So this next question, I'm also a tea drinker. Is wild bergamot related to the bergamot that's in Earl Grey tea?
I'm going to take this as well, because up until last night, I thought it was. I'd been told my entire life that wild bergamot was, yeah, it was one of the components of Earl Grey tea. And I dispelled that myth last night as I was looking into it, fortunately, because I thought this question might come up. No, bergamot is actually, the bergamot used in Earl Grey tea is a type of citrus fruit found in Italy and in Europe. So it's completely different from the wild bergamot that we have here in Ontario. Although wild bergamot does have a very interesting smell to it. Like I said, it's sort of like an oregano smell.
Okay, great answer. This next one, how can you tell if an ash has been affected by an ash borer? And if I see an emerald ash borer, should I step on it to help save the trees? This has been so fascinating. Thank you, Adam and Brian.
Hey, I'll take that one. Yeah, when you see an ash tree and it's affected by the ash borer, you can see the tree canopy. So that's the part where all the leaves are above the forest. They start to get thinner and thinner and thinner. So the tree actually physically looks like it's sick. And a lot of times when a tree is suffering from some kind of a disease or a drought, it produces these small, we call them epicormic shoots, which are just a lot of small little branches that it tries to shoot out from the base of the tree all along the trunk. So you'll see like a lot of these little tiny branches all along the trunk, and that means there's something affecting that tree. The emerald ash borer leaves a little tiny D-shaped hole in the trunk. So if you look at an ash, you'll see a little tiny hole that looks like a D. So that's the insect. As it pupates, it comes out of that hole. Yeah, if you see one, stomp on it. That's good advice.
Okay, all right, thanks. Great answer, Brian. And then the last question, this references, I think, the beginning of the presentation where Adam kicked it off, and the question is, what is meant by a vascular plant?
Oh yeah, okay. So a vascular plant is just a plant that has like a circulatory system, kind of like we have a system for blood, but plants have a system where there's fluids and energy moving from the flowers down to the roots and back and forth like that. So that's a plant's vascular system. So something that isn't included in a vascular plant would be a fungus. All mushrooms are fungi. They're not vascular plants because mushrooms are fruiting bodies of the fungus, which is like sort of a web of tiny little filaments underneath the soil that pop up mushrooms. So when we talk about vascular plants, we're talking about plants that have a system to move energy and nutrients and resources throughout the entire body of the plant.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So Adam, Brian, thank you so much for a great webinar. I know we all learned a lot. And again, these are really, really popular with lots of great questions. So it's clear to us that you're both experts and knowledgeable, and we're so lucky to work with you at the BTC. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you that joined us today. And we look forward to seeing you in webinars again in November, I guess Jackie said. So have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.